I'm Catherine Flashner, and this is The Truth Is, a podcast about discovering what it means to live your truth. Even when it's messy, when it unravels the plans you thought you had, and invites you to step into the unknown. Each week, we explore practices, stories, and conversations that illuminate the ways we find and follow our own path. This is a space to slow down, ask questions, and uncover what's been quietly waiting inside of you. If it resonates, subscribing, following, and engaging with the show really supports me in bringing more people into the conversation. Thank you for being here. Welcome to The Truth Is.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Truth Is. I'm Catherine, and I am coming to you by myself this week. I've had such rich conversations over the past month, and honestly, I wanted to take a pause with you to really reflect on and share some of the big insights and questions that have entered my life because of those conversations. You know, we take in so much information all of the time, whether it is on our feeds with good intent or staying informed in the chaos of the world that we are living in right now. And one thing that underlies all of the conversations I've had over the last month is the imperative need to take the space to process all that is happening in our lives. And so this is my way of doing that with you. You know, I want this body of work in this podcast to offer you a space to process your own life and crystallize how these conversations land for you uniquely. Because I can't tell you what they reveal for you. Only you can. And we need the space to do that, right? I am also the person that sometimes listens to a podcast on 2x speed on my commute into work. And so my offering with this brief solo time, and, you know, maybe I'll try to do it once a month or every few months, is to create that space with you and pose a few insights and a few questions that I've been really sitting with from these conversations that you can then sit with for yourself. So thank you for listening. I had the opportunity last week to attend and sit on a panel and work as a facilitator in an event put on by my first guest this season, Catherine Naylor Pullman, in her wonderful organization called Our Third Place. And she had a wonderful panel of women and entrepreneurs in the health and wellness space. And she asked us to share one of what we perceive as our big wins for our respective line of work and some of the key learnings that we're gathering and that we want to share. And it had me pause to think about, like, what is my work with this thing? And it's interesting, you know, it always started with this question of what does it mean to live true to ourselves? And that's the simple premise of this whole show. And recently, you know, certainly throughout the second season, I realized that to ask ourselves that question, what does it mean to live true to ourselves? How do we even access that and discern what that feels like? And then, moreover, why don't we do that? Why do we go through our lives creating identities that can tend to drift away from who we truly are? And then we have this fracturing and distance between the two things that I think can create a lot of discontentment and suffering. And what I'm sitting with right now is that in order to ask those fundamental questions about ourselves and about each other, like, what does it mean to live truthfully? Why don't we do that? Those questions are inherently connected to looking critically and objectively at the world and the systems that we live in. If I look over the last month of my 4 guests from February, we started the month with Sam Bianchini, who is this incredible practitioner and teacher of these ancient and transformative rest rituals and practices. And there's this simple idea that rest is actually a return to who we are. And why don't we do that? Well, we talk a lot on that episode about the hustle culture that I grew up in, that I became a professional in, that our worth becomes inherently connected to how hard we work and how we constantly prove ourselves. And then we can start to pride ourselves on that. I know that I did, is a detriment to any sort of rest. I remember days early in my career after graduate school where I would stay up all night making a presentation for an executive that I worked with, and it was less about the content in the actual presentation and more about me being able to say that I stayed up all night in this like sacrificial way. And the permeation of hustle culture, shows up in our lives in so many different ways. But what I want to point out is that inherent connection, right? The lesson that Sam offered us at the beginning of the month is that rest is a return to who we are. It's paramount that we incorporate it into our lives. And why don't we do that? Well, cultural conditioning has told us the opposite, that rest is a form of laziness, of weakness, that we won't, for me, be safe, secure, abundant if we allow ourselves to rest. Now, to take a pause and reflecting on my guest, what I want to say about the event last week is when Catherine prompted us to think about, our host last week prompted us to think about what is a win from my line of work that I want everyone to know about. I was like, well, I'm sitting in this space where we're kind of examining the culture that we live in and how it keeps us from ourselves. One of the wins that I've come to believe through my conversations is that burnout is no longer viewed as this personal failure. And in fact, the World Health Organization classifies it now as this occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress. I think that's really important because I think about my years pushing down my exhaustion and kind of being in this cycle of being hard on myself and even shaming myself for not being able to do more all the time. I'm now coming to really see clearly that, one, my best work does not happen from that perpetual hamster wheel. And two, the question I feel is shifting from what is wrong with me that I cannot push through to what part of the system or the workplace that I'm operating in is making this sustainably harder than it needs to be. And so I'm very grateful that the conversations over the last month have really emphasized and strengthened for me that this is not a journey of individualism, this idea of excavating how we live truthfully. This is a trusting our lived experience and our sense of our experiences to critique the world that we are living in and design it to be better. And it may not sound, it's not, we haven't landed at the full win, but the win for me is that shift in consciousness and that shift in collective consciousness away from personal pressure, personal failure, that like burnout isn't a personal failure. It's a design flaw. It is a systems problem that we are susceptible to perpetuating. And though we have the agency to interrupt it for ourselves. So why do I think that cultural truth or awareness or shift in understanding is so important to this work of living truthfully? Well, throughout this season, I've been pulling this thread of like, how do we access who we are beneath the noise, beneath who we think we should be and maybe are performing as, to who we truly deeply are? And how do we even know the difference? And it's interesting. One of the reasons that pulling this particular thread has felt so important to me personally is that it's so subtly deceiving, in my opinion, that we can stay not just hyper busy for the sake of achieving, furthering ourselves, like all with well intent. But then in the space of like self-knowledge and self-optimization, I used to equate like knowing myself and furthering myself with more effort. What I've learned from my guests, certainly over the last month and throughout the season, is that the furthering and knowing ourselves actually comes from that space to process and that space to discover how we feel about our lives as we're pursuing it and as it's happening. What my last several conversations have taught me a lot about from a nervous system backed lens is that we will move through our busy lives without knowing ourselves if we do not find the space to process and pause. And to extend that further to my conversation with Joy Craig last week, and we will not reclaim agency and organization and the ability to build the world that we want to live in if we do not pull back from the chronic busyness and the chronic intake of information to pause and to calibrate to who we are. That permission thread was really pulled with my conversation with Cindy Sharkey, who's a sex educator with 40 years of experience as a nurse, and her entire body of work is looking at the gap between the healthcare system and our cultural conversation around sensuality and sex, particularly for women, and what's missing, and how that it actually keeps women from understanding and knowing and accepting themselves. And her whole body of work is around permission for pleasure, permission to feel through your life, to get curious about your senses and your experiences. And it turned into this permission to feel it all. And our culture, I think, is so dangerously used to telling us how to feel. Like there is so much certainty being voiced at us on the internet. And what's scary, and there's people that articulate this better than I do, but when something works for someone, the assumption that it will work for everyone else, but does not take into any account how individual our lives and experiences are. Which is why in this space, like I'm so allergic to prescribing advice or like do these 3 things to live truthfully. Like I can offer gentle reflections and guideposts, but ultimately the core principle of this show is that I don't know. You know what's true for you, and you know what is possible in your own life, what's underneath there wanting your attention. All I can do is ask you to look. Nahid de Belgion, who I interviewed a few weeks ago, who's a nervous system educator out of the UK, says it well as she works with these really high achieving women on tuning into and creating flexibility in their nervous systems. They'll say to her, "Am I doing it right?" And she says, "I don't know. How does it feel in your body?" So this idea that I've been sitting with is regulation is the precursor to any revelation about who we are, what we want to be up to, what's asking for our attention. As an antidote to the whole bit on hustle culture and burnout, in the years since I've left the corporate world, I've done some consulting work for friends that are founders. Certainly in building this podcast, there is a clear distinction when I am down a rabbit hole intellectually, staring at my computer screens, trying to come up with like the next strategic move, versus being in my yoga practice, being on a hike with my dog, being in morning stillness without my phone. My best ideas, and I might even dare say the ideas that end up consistently carrying me forward, happen in the latter. And that was confusing for me to process because I, again, was so conditioned to white knuckle through to the finish line to the enoughness, to the proving something made strategic sense. It almost was too good to trust to be true, that no, is the answer already inside me and I just have to quiet so that I can hear it? So I love this idea of we regulate, whatever that looks like for you. We find the space to process our lives, to be with ourselves. And that's where the revelation comes. I'll point back to one of my cherished conversations from late last year with Jedediah Jenkins. We talk a lot about this idea of revelation. And he says something like, these moments of revelation where everything comes into view. We talk about it in the context of, if you're unfamiliar, when he turned 30, he quit his job in nonprofit as a lawyer to bike from Oregon to Patagonia for 18 months. And the idea came when he met someone that he worked with that had gone on a wild bike ride for several months that was so unconventional seeming. And in that conversation, the guy just goes to Jed, "You should go on a bike trip." And Jed, without hesitation, goes, "Yeah, I'm going to do it." We talk about that moment, and what he says about that moment is, we can deem it as crazy or unpredictable or random. But he's like, I actually believe that revelation is just the proper organizing of all the things happening in the background in our subconscious that we're processing without being maybe aware of all the time, all of a sudden coming into clear view. And so these revelations about who we are, about where we want to orient our lives, we don't have to go find them in the intellectual sense. Sometimes, perhaps, it's just the softening and the stillness so that we can listen for it and be ready to receive it. And so I'd ask you, is like an inquiry question for today, where did your last revelation come from? Where did your last clear thought, clear direction, oh, that's it, come from? What were you doing? Who were you with? What did it feel like? And can you learn to trust that, to listen to it, to not override it as random? I want to shift gears and offer one other thing. I've touched on the wisdom of rest, which I think is a beautiful return to that stillness, to that self. Cindy Sharkey and I talk about then permission to feel all of it and honor all of it. Nahid and I talk about making sure there's space to process our life. And she brings it to such a powerful and necessary cultural critique. The systems that we live in are designed to keep us from ourselves, from our truths. And right now, perhaps more than ever, in my lifetime at least, we need to process what is happening so that we can speak truth to this moment. I wanted to offer this idea that I think lands in the context of what I was just talking about. This kind of juxtaposition I'm feeling with the tone of certainty versus the tone of curiosity. I was on a plane last night and I watched the movie The Big Short. I watched it after watching Industry Season 4 finale. I won't go down my rabbit hole because I would love to host a companion podcast one day for all my favorite shows. But I then was inspired to watch The Big Short, which I'd never seen, which is about the housing crisis in 2008. And it opens with a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain. And I'm going to read it. It says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." I might have mentioned a few minutes ago why I feel it's so important to not prescribe advice around what you should do to access yourself. Like saying that aloud, it doesn't even make sense. Like my view of what you should do, uniquely you, to stay true to yourself. I can't answer that for you. And I think there's a lot on the internet in the space of self-improvement, self-knowledge that with good intention can tend to do that. And I find over the last few months that If I stay too caught up in that being messaged to me, it actually subtly keeps me from myself even longer. Why does this have to do with The Big Short and like a broader cultural conversation? Well, I think we live in a hyper-connected world where there's a lot that's messaged to us as certainty. In discerning what's true is not an easy exercise anymore on a personal level, on a communal, and on a collective level. I think we all know that. I think we all know that we live in these information silos that can not only keep us from ourselves, but keep us from seeing each other clearly. That brings me to my conversation last week with Jory Craig. We talk a lot about a lot of things in that conversation. She is a voice of reason, and her career has been at the intersection of technology, digital media, public opinion, politics. And we talk about how these systems that give us our information by design want to keep us scrolling, exhausted. I go on to say anxious, sleep deprived. That keeps us on the platforms perpetually. And that we're in a moment that is asking us to reorient our attention back to what's real, going against an opposing reality where there is a lot that is not real being generated that we soon will not be able to discern. We already probably can't discern, quite frankly. And so I was listening to a trauma therapist a month ago on the ground in Minneapolis talk about the feeling of helplessness persists from inaction. And Jory talks well about what moving through this moment together is going to take of us. Then she says, well, when we pull our attention away from the constant like fire hosing of information, we get to discern where we put our attention. You know, that film made me think a lot about the false certainties that can be messaged to us about the way things are. And I think the moment that we are living in is revealing to us that the way things are is not the world that we're choosing to accept anymore for ourselves and for each other. And right now, this moment needs our attention. And Jory frames so well, similarly to what is kind of excavated in The Big Short, where, individuals outsourced their judgment and certainty to systems and rating agencies and models and institutions that kind of, blanketly decided if the system says it's safe, it's safe. I think Jory takes a similar lens and and spells out a similar discernment about the information landscape, where our attention, and now it almost feels like our attachment, is the economic asset in a system that profits on our attention, anxiety, outrage, fear. She proclaims the need for us to pull back so that we can reclaim where we choose to orient our attention and our energy. We get to decide what is urgent, not our notifications. And that what is true is not decided by virality and volume. So the feed doesn't need to become the authority. We don't need to surrender our orientation to it. This is related, I think, on a personal level to the questions around identity and truth that I ask on this podcast, because it is, again, a great example of not outsourcing authority to culture. Whether it is outsourcing success to corporate versions of it, understanding that being desirable means being visible, or our worthiness means productivity. Alignment means external validation. It's peeling back the layers on all of those things to question them for ourselves. And Jory says, well, doesn't mean don't stay informed and stay engaged in the world. It means getting clear so that we can most impactfully. Now, I want to bring this home with a few closing thoughts, but after our episode, Jory and I reflected on this idea of where in our world and in the places that we occupy do we see and experience an incentive for integrity. It feels like we're void of that. And however, Jory leaves us with, she talks about the concept of dark hope. That when things get as dark as they feel lately, all that's left is perhaps to hope. Said a different way, she talks about we're so disconnected from one another that all that's left is to connect again. And I want to end this conversation with you today in the space of just that. Because having these conversations and dealing with the uncomfortable truths about the moment that we're in together and individually right now, my deepest hope is that these conversations bring you back to your own sense of agency, that you get to decide how you move through your day, to be in relationship with yourself, processing life as it's happening so that you get to decide how you show up. It's a scary thing that I feel like I've been learning over the past year. You hear the old cliche or adage that's like, no one's coming to save you. Nobody's coming to save you. And it's been a humbling process, but also empowering and liberating to feel like at the same time I'm stepping into my own life and authoring my own life, I also get to show up in my communities and in the world in a way that is uniquely me, that is my contribution, that is I want to say the word studentship, like permission to show up and get it wrong, but be alive and be in community. And when I asked Jory the big question last week of like, what do we do? It's like, what do we do? And I touched on a lot of it, or a good amount of it. And if you haven't listened to the episode, I highly recommend it. But I want to leave with one fun thing that I said in my event last week. That's something that I think everyone should know. She said, what do we do? Well, she says, it's a big question. But then she offered, end this year with more friends than you started the year with. She talks about how it is so critical now to be in intergenerational anything. Be in intergenerational connection, be in connection with your peers, whatever that looks like. One of the things that I'm most hopeful about is these consumer trends we're experiencing of people wanting to be offline together. We're yearning for it. We need it. Whether you have an AI companion or not, make more real friends. We're not supposed to sit in our houses alone. The world needs us to not sit in our houses alone. It might feel like visionary or audacious, but my belief is that we are in a reimagining of how we live and work and be together sustainably. And that we are the adults in the room that get to decide what that looks like. So that's what I'm going to leave us with today. And I want to say, if you're here with me at the end of this solo episode, you're one of my people through and through. I'm in the work of extending this podcast and this platform into new offerings and new containers so that my listeners and my community members can be an active part of the conversation for themselves and contribute. And that's going to look like a couple different things. I'm building a retreat program that I am getting input on right now. I'll link that in the show notes. And then I'm also working on a program that I will likely host online that is a 5-week container called Calibration, for folks that want to take the space to tune back into what is true for them and discern their next step forward, not from a place of fear or should, but from a place of what is true for you. And so look out for that from me. I always love to hear from you on Instagram, but thank you for joining me in this space of synthesis, of processing, of making sense without more input. We need it. I need it. And I hope it was useful to you as well. I will see you next time on The Truth Is.
I hope you leave this episode with something that stays with you, a question worth holding or an insight worth following. If this conversation resonated, subscribing or sharing the episode helps bring more people into the conversation. And connect with The Truth Is at The Truth Is Podcast on Instagram. Special thanks to the people who make this show possible. Editing by Dan Kroll. Video production and editing by Anton LaPlume. Music by Will Savino. Visual identity by Sarah Gaynor and Jonathan Bush. And guidance from my friend and advisor, Natalie Tulloch. I'm Catherine Flashner. Thank you for listening to The Truth Is.